Ken Wilber is the next step up from Graves. So Wilber is the master synthesis. Wilber was able to take what Graves and all of these other people did and see patterns in them that other people had not seen. So Ken went through some major traumatic stages in his life, including the death of a beloved wife. And so he went into seclusion for a couple of years after that. And so what he did is he was an amazing synthesis. So there were all of these developmentalists, and he took and wrote out on a pad what all of the stages and everything were, and he laid it out on the floor of a room, and probably this size. And he'd sit there and he would go from one to the other, and he looked at it, and finally everything began to come together. And he came up with the bigger picture, the biggest picture we got available to us at the moment. So he started off as a transpersonal psychologist. He no longer considers himself that, but that was a stage he went through. So what is a transpersonal psychologist? A transpersonal psychologist was a person that believes that human beings go through certain stages of development. We start in matter, then we go into life, then we go into mind, then we go into soul, and then we go into spirit. Now, normal psychology says, okay, body okay, emotions, heart okay, mind, head okay, soul, spirit, not okay. So what transpersonal psychology says, if you've got a truncated view of humans and of human development, you're going to have a truncated understanding of human beings. Now, Ken is saying today that transpersonal psychology and psychology in general is dead because that we need many more things to understand people. So we need a synthesis of psychology, anthropology, sociology, a whole variety of things to come together that'll give us an even bigger understanding. The problem is the university system, where if you've got any field of intellectual endeavor, if it doesn't fit into a university department, then it doesn't exist. And if it tries to cross boundaries between departments, that's even more frightening to the academics. Now, Ken is also an interesting person in as much as for lack of a better word, we could call him a mystic. He's been very deeply involved in spiritual development for most of his life. And that he is spent years in meditation and various forms of Buddhist spiritual work, and has reached a very high level within that spiritual development, one that few people on the planet are able to get to. So as an example of what these levels of spiritual development are, at the highest levels, people that are cross-cultural in different spiritual traditions have certain indicators that allow them to understand when somebody's reached that level. So one of the things is he's able to maintain consciousness continuously for days on end, which means that when he goes to bed at night, then what happens is first he's aware of the hypnagogic process, and then he moves into delta. He maintains awareness for that. In the morning, the process reverses and he wakes up, and he's able to stay in awareness on a continuing basis. Obviously, most of us, when we go to sleep, we lose consciousness and that's it. He's able to maintain consciousness during those states. And there's various levels of brain waves, as you all are probably familiar with. So you've got the standard beta, alpha, theta, and delta. And that we're told that, once again, that the theta is the hypnagogic state, and the delta occurs in deep sleep, and that we have no awareness, and it's the time when our body rejuvenates and replenishes itself. Well, it was believed you could have no conscious awareness in deep sleep and in delta. Till about 20 years ago, a Himalayan Swami by the name of Swami Rama came to the Miniger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas, and he wanted to demonstrate what a yoga could do. So he did some interesting things like cutting off the blood flow to both his arms and both his legs by varying the temperature between 2 points in his palm of his hand, 1.5 inches apart, by like 17 degrees. He was able to stop his heart from beating, and they thought he had a heart attack. They were really concerned about that. And then they hooked him up to the EEG machine. So once he figured out what they meant by all of these different terms, He was able to produce perfect beta on demand, synchronous and asynchronous. Now, normally, most of us, one hemisphere is doing one thing, another hemisphere is doing another thing. He was able to get them together. Then he was able to produce perfect alpha on demand, synchronous and synchronous. Then he produced perfect theta on demand, synchronous and asynchronous. And then he got to delta. And so he appeared to be asleep. He appeared to snore. He put himself in this state for about 15 minutes on the EEG machine. He was producing perfect delta. And during this time, they read out loud 2 short poems. At the end of this time, he spontaneously aroused himself after 15 minutes. He was able to repeat verbatim the 2 short poems, plus the conversations that had occurred in 2 adjacent rooms that they weren't even aware were going on. That was the first recorded evidence scientifically that somebody could create delta and have awareness of delta. Now, Ken is able to go beyond that. You can hook a Ken up to the machine. He can create perfect delta where he's carrying on a conversation while he's giving a lecture. He can go into any of these states and at will and operate in any of these states. So he's done some pretty amazing things with what he's been able to do with these levels of spiritual development. Tony Schwartz, who came to, some of you may have met Tony because Eben brought him to the original Get Altitude program. And so Tony Schwartz wrote a book on searching for wisdom in America. And he went out and interviewed a lot of people, and he said Wilber was the wisest man in America. Now, another thing about Wilber that's very interesting, that's different from most people. Most of us pursue an idea, and even though we realize that parts of it are not working, that we don't turn back. We keep on the road. We try to force fit it. We try to convince ourselves and everybody else that we're right. Wilber, to his incredible credit, has changed himself 5 different times, has reinvented himself. Originally, he started off as a romantic, and he thought that that was the way things were. And when he looked into it further, he realized that didn't work. And he was willing and honest to say that and said yes. So they went to another stage of development, and up to now there's been like 5 stages of his development. He's now in Wilber 5, and I'm sure Wilber 6 will come next. So that's an amazing thing about him. So one of the things, you may be confused if you read some of his books, and we'll talk about those at some point as we go on. And if you read some of the earlier books, have nothing to do with where he's at the moment. So those were things that he explored, those were avenues he went down, and then he discovered that that was a dead end, and he had the courage and the capability to turn around, to come back, and to find another avenue to explore. And also, he's a very powerful social critic. So that's